And after the security breach, 3 social media sites took action against Trump's accounts with regard to the video where he called the election results fraudulent. While Twitter deleted his tweet and blocked him for 12 hours, Facebook followed suit and went on to block him for a day. YouTube has removed that video. The sites have clarified that the action was taken to prevent the spread of misinformation. Now, my colleague Tanima Biswas is going to tell you how the attack on the US Capitol was encouraged by President Trump's continuous rhetoric, claiming that the US elections were fraudulent, which also include a prolonged legal battle.
It is, of course, something which was unimaginable and unprecedented, but it's very important to also understand and put context to how we actually came about to see what happened at the US Capitol yesterday. Let's take a look at where it all started. Of course, this is about the dispute that Trump has in fact been, the challenge rather that he has in fact been making with regard to the US election results. So essentially, if we look at going back to the US elections when it was held, it was the 3rd of November when the elections were held. The results after came out, of course, came out shortly after the counting actually went on for almost 5 days, that we can see when the results actually came out, and in a way, of course, it indicated that Joe Biden has in fact the one, and he's going to be the next US president. But Donald Trump, the outgoing US president, continued to refuse to accept the fact that he has in fact been beaten. In fact, what we can see, what follows is that there have been a series of, protests that we have seen from him, and whether or not it is in terms of releasing videos against it, or whether it is in terms of actually addressing rallies where he talked about it. He says that despite losing the election, he in fact disputed the results. And what we can in fact see is that he goes on constantly through him and through other leaders around him. He continues to dispute the election results state by state, that what had happened. In fact, there's continuous comments about the Democrats stealing the election. In fact, steal the election was the phrase that Trump actually coined and gave it out to his supporters, we can see. And later on also, when protests actually took place on the streets of America, whether it was in Washington or other areas, we can in fact see that steal the vote in fact was one of the slogans that it in fact was circulated by Trump to his supporters, and he created a false narrative of election fraud without any evidence. There has not been, we have also seen Trump actually trying to legally challenge this in several courts. He's failed in that as well, but he continues to do that. Creating a false narrative. And what we have also seen in the following days, in fact just a few days back, if you remember, that an audio tape which actually leaked, in which he was heard talking to the top election officer from the state of Georgia, saying that he needed around 11,000 odd votes and somehow he must help Trump in finding those votes. That is also another thing. So even till just a couple of days back, Trump was carrying on with his agenda. There were several Republican lawmakers also who had in fact challenged election results. As I said, like legally, he made an attempt to challenge the results. And we can in fact see that today, though, we have in fact seen some of his close aides, including the US Vice President Mike Pence, actually condemning the violence and not agreeing with him. On Jan 6th, if we look at this, the Congress joint session yesterday was held in order to confirm Joe Biden's electoral college win. So that was what they were doing. They were actually certifying the electoral college votes. And it was at that time that we saw that Trump actually held a rally just an hour before the US Congress actually convened. Trump had held a rally in Washington, D.C., urging his supporters to come to Washington. And earlier, in fact, he held a rally urging his supporters to come to Washington. And there was a high alert sounded as Trump supporters were expected to gather. So in a way, the police and the administration in Washington, D.C. were, of course, aware that something might come up. But it was primarily on Jan 6 that Trump supporters gathered in thousands at Capitol Hill that we saw those scenes which we have been playing out since morning on how the protesters gathered. They were, of course, we had also played out for our viewers that comment of Donald Trump, in fact, the address that he made at that rally where he says we are not going to concede, we are going to not give up, and in a way that we cannot continue with letting them steal the vote. Those were the slogans and the same rhetoric that he continued even till the last minute. And despite the fact that after this he actually issued an appeal to his supporters saying that they must go home. But again, we saw him continuing with that narrative of it being a fraudulent election.